Alright, this is chapter 6 of part 1 of The Devils by Fyodor Dostoevsky. They spent almost the whole winter season in Petersburg. By Lent, however, everything burst like a rainbow-colored soap bubble. Their dreams vanished into thin air, and the confusion, far from being cleared up, became worse confounded. To begin with, the connections with the higher circles failed to materialize, except on a very microscopic scale, and at the cost of humiliating efforts. Deeply mortified, Mrs. Stavrogin at first showed a violent interest in the new ideas and began giving evening parties. She sent out invitations to literary people, and hundreds of them immediately turned up at her house. Afterwards they came without being invited, and they brought their friends with them. Never in her life had she seen such literary men. They were incredibly vain, but made no secret of it, as though they were so unprincipled. Some, though by no means all, turned up drunk, but they seemed to regard it as some new manifestation of grace they had discovered only the day before. They all appeared to be quite extraordinarily proud of something. On all faces it was written that they had only just discovered some highly important secret. They abused each other and were proud of it. It was not easy to find out exactly what they had written, but there were critics, novelists, dramatists, satirists, and exposers of abuses among them. Mr. Verkovensky wormed his way into their highest circle from which the movement was directed. It was a stiff climb, but they welcomed him with open arms, though of course none of them knew or had heard anything about him, except that he represented an idea. He maneuvered so skillfully among them that he prevailed upon them to go twice to Miss Stavrogin's salon. In spite of their Olympian grandeur, these people were very serious and exceedingly polite. They behaved with decorum. The others were evidently afraid of them, but it was clear that they had no time to waste. 2 or 3 former literary celebrities also put in an appearance. They happened to be in Petersburg at the time, and Mrs. Stavrogin had long been maintaining a most refined relationship with them. But to her surprise, these real and quite indubitable celebrities were as quiet as mice, and some of them simply hung on to this new rabble and carried favor with them shamelessly. At first, Mr. Verkovensky was in luck. He was seized and exhibited at literary meetings. When he appeared for the first time on the platform at one of these public readings, he was given a great ovation which lasted for 5 minutes. He recalled it with tears 9 years later, though more because of his artistic nature than out of gratitude. "I swear to you, and I'm ready to have a bet on it," he told me himself, but only to me and in secret. And not a man in the audience knew anything about me, not a thing. It was a remarkable confession, for it meant that he possessed an acute intelligence if he could realize his position so clearly on the platform in spite of his tremendous excitement at the time. But on the other hand, it meant too that he did not possess an acute intelligence if even 9 years later he could not recall it without a feeling of resentment. He was made to sign 2 or 3 collective protests. He did not know himself against what he signed them. Mrs. Stavrogin, too, was made to sign a protest against some revolting action, and she too signed. However, though the majority of these new men were present at Mrs. Stavrogin's parties, they thought it for some reason their duty to regard her with contempt and unconcealed derision. Mr. Verkovensky used to hint to me afterwards, in his moments of bitterness, that it was from that time that she began envying him. She realized, of course, that it was not her business to associate with these people, but she received them eagerly for all that, with the hysterical impatience so characteristic of a woman, and above all, she always expected something to happen. At her evening parties she talked little, though she could talk if she wanted to, but mostly she preferred to listen. They talked about the abolition of the censorship and spelling reform, of the substitution of the Roman alphabet for the Russian one, of the exile of someone the day before, of some public disturbance in the shopping arcade, and of the advisability of a federal constitution for the different nationalities in Russia, of the abolition of the army and the navy, of the restoration of Poland as far as the Dnieper, of the agrarian reform and of the political pamphlets, of the abolition of inheritance, the family, children, and the priesthood, of the rights of women, of Karyavsky's splendid house, for which no one seemed able to forgive Mr. Karyavsky, Mr. Krajewski, and so on and so forth. It was obvious that among that rabble of new men there were many impostors, but it was no less obvious that there were also a great many good, honest people among them, in spite of certain rather striking dissimilarities of character. The honest ones were much more incomprehensible than the coarse and dishonest ones, but it was impossible to tell which was the tool of which. When Mrs. Stavrogin announced her intention of publishing a periodical, many more people flocked to her receptions, but almost at once accusations that she was a capitalist and an exploiter of labor were hurled against her. The familiarity of these accusations was equaled only by their unexpectedness. The aged General Ivan Drozdov, a former friend and fellow officer of the late General Stavrogin, a most worthy man in his own way, of course, a man we all know to be extremely stubborn and irritable, who ate a lot and who was terribly afraid of atheism, had an argument at one of Mrs. Stavrogin's parties with a certain famous young man, who immediately said to him, "You must be a general to talk like that," meaning that he could find no word of abuse worse than general. General Drozdov flew into a great rage. "Yes, sir," he said, "I am a general and lieutenant general, and a lieutenant general, and I have served my sovereign, and you, sir, are a puppy and an atheist." A most unfortunate scene followed. Next day, the incident was adversely commented on in the press, and signatures were immediately collected for a protest against the outrageous conduct of Mrs. Stavrogin for refusing to turn the general out of her house at once. A cartoon was published in an illustrated magazine in which Mrs. Stavrogin, the general, and Mr. Verkovensky were all most venomously caricatured as three reactionary friends. There were even verses underneath the cartoon written by popular poets specially for the occasion. I may add for my part that it is quite true that many that it is quite true that many it is quite true that many army officers of the rank of general have an absurd habit of saying, "I have served my sovereign," as though wishing to imply that their sovereign is not the same as the sovereign of ordinary subjects, but a special one that belongs only to them. It was impossible, of course, to remain any longer in Petersburg, particularly as Mr. Verkovensky suffered a complete fiasco. Um, he could not retain himself and began talking about the prerogatives of art, which made people laugh at him louder than ever. At his last public reading, he thought it expedient to attempt to impress his audience by patriotic eloquence, imagining that he would touch their hearts and counting on their respect for his exile. He was quite willing to admit the uselessness and absurdity of the word mother country. He declared his readiness to accept the idea of the harmfulness of religion, but firmly and loudly declared that boots were less important than Pushkin, and very much so. He was booed so mercilessly that he burst into tears there and then, and on the platform in full view of the audience. Mrs. Stavrogin took him home more dead than alive. Um, Okay, so here's my attempt at reading this. On ma trati como on vous bonnet de coton, he babbled senselessly. She looked after him all night, gave him laurel and cherry drops, repeating to him till daybreak, "You're still useful. You'll still make a public appearance. You'll be appreciated in another place." Early next morning, five literary gentlemen, three of whom were complete strangers, came to see Mrs. Stavrogin. They told her sternly that they had looked into the question of her periodical and had come to a decision in that matter. Mrs. Stavrogin had certainly never asked anybody to look into the question of her magazine or take any decision about it. Her decision was that, having founded her magazine, she should immediately hand it over to them with the capital to run it on the basis of a free cooperative association. She herself was to go back to Shavershniki, not forgetting to take with her Mr. Verkovinsky, who was out of date. Anxious to play fair, they agreed to recognize the rights of property in her case and to send her every year a sixth part of the net profits. The really touching thing about the whole proposal was that certainly four out of the five gentlemen had no selfish motives in making it, but were simply acting in the name of the cause. We left Petersburg completely dazed. Mr. Verkovinsky used to say, I was completely at a loss what to make of it all, and I remember I kept muttering some nonsense verse to the rumble of the train. Goodness only knows what, all the way to Moscow. It was only in Moscow that I recovered my senses, just as though I really could find something very different there. Oh, my friends, he sometimes cried in a moment of inspiration. You can't imagine the sadness and resentment that fill your soul to overflowing every time a great idea you have long revered as sacred is taken up by some bunglers who drag it out into the street to fools like themselves. And you suddenly come across it in the flea market, unrecognizable, bespattered and with mud, set up in a ridiculous fashion, at an absurd angle, without proportion, without harmony, the plaything of stupid children. No, it was different in our time, and it wasn't that we strove for. No, no, not that at all. I don't recognize anything anymore. But our day will dawn again and again. We shall put on the right path. Oh, jeez. But our day will dawn again and again. We shall put on the right path. Everything that is now tottering and unsteady. Otherwise, what is going to happen? Question mark. End of chapter 6. Motherfucker.